right, so I have a 30-minute talk. I'm going to speak quickly. I'm going to go ahead and just lay some groundwork here and tell you I have a lot of slides. I did that so that after this, if there is something that you thought was useful in there, the content is going to be in the slides instead of bailing out and showing you some demos outside of that. So when I was originally putting this together, I kind of reached out to Keith and I said, I don't know, all these people are super smart. If I can contribute something, that would be awesome. And he said, security stuff would be cool. You do that? And I said, I do. So I went over to Tom at CWMP and I said, so out of the security stuff, what do people struggle with and what are the challenges? So I took that along with my experience and put this together. It was the top 5 security concepts for wireless LAN. Squishing it down into a 30-minute session, it was supposed to be the top 3, but I just couldn't help myself, so it's top 3.5. You'll see what I mean. And that kind of looks like these things here. So a little bit of 802.1x and radius and EAP stuff. And some of this is, I'll kind of give you some anecdotes and a little bit of background, my history with that. The next thing is just a couple tidbits about certificates. We're not going to go into a whole PKI class here because, frankly, I don't like that. I don't do it, and it's boring. A little bit of best practices there, and then obligatory WPA3 and OWE update. So I looked through the agenda, and I was like, well, somebody else is going to cover this, and I'm just going to go, hey, this person's going to cover this later. And I looked at the agenda, and I didn't see anybody actually covering it. So I'm going to try, if we make it all the way there in 30 minutes, that's great. If not, you guys can check out slides later. So very brief intro, because I know a lot of you guys don't know who I am, and I don't want to bore you with this, but I do work for an integrator based out of North Carolina called Carolina Advanced Digital. We've been in business for 35 years. I work with Shatal, who's over there. Hi. I told you I was going to embarrass you. And so we've been doing enterprise networking the entire time, wireless for more than 20 years, which is pre-standard, and we've been security focused for about 15. I've been working in the industry, getting a paycheck and paying taxes since I was 14. Part-time, obviously, I was in school. So I'm old, and I've been doing this for a little bit. My background is a lot in switch route and wireless with some security. So that's just context there. I've done a lot of different vendor stuff. We are an integrator. I see people giggling. Are you giggling at like the Maru certifications that are up there and like the really old crap? Is that what you're giggling at? Yeah. So working for an integrator, we do a lot of different stuff, right? I work with customers ranging from your typical K-12 schools all the way up to higher ed. Some of my customers are actually nuclear facility, both with Department of Energy and private. A lot of utilities, manufacturing, power distribution. So kind of all over the place. So it's my job to know a little bit about everything and a lot about these things here. It did occur to me that the only thing that might be interesting is, hey, Wes. Where's Wes? Where'd Wes go? I have this thing too. Yeah. I'm just using it to show you that I have it now because I thought it was really cool. Anyway, so low-tech hacking, I was an author on a book, and I wrote the wireless security chapter of that. It's a few years old, but I have ownership rights of the PDF, so if you guys remind me after this, I will make that public to everybody. I've never published it. Yep. I don't know that that's worth clapping for, but okay. And then also, I do have a lot of content at my personal blog, which is securityuncorked.com. I know it says security, but you'll actually find a lot of wireless stuff there. It's not as cool as Andrew's and everybody else's, but sometimes there's graphics. I like pictures. I do my own graphics. There's some cool stuff there. All right, so jumping in. The first piece here, the radius 802.1x stuff. For those of you that already know this, and this is really boring, take a nap. Just don't snore and wake up your neighbor. You're not going to hurt my feelings. So the kind of 10,000-foot view here, and so what I pulled out here was based, again, on talking to Tom, and then also just my experience working with hundreds of different customers in a consulting role or an engagement role, working with my team, and kind of just seeing the same patterns of where people got hung up on things. So very high level, kind of 80-20 rule here about, I can totally geek out on 802.1x. I might be the only person in the world who has read every page of every standard revision of 802.1x ever published, and that's several thousands of pages. I'm not actually proud of that. Obviously, I had no life throughout my 20s, but here we are. So the 10,000-foot view here is just what do you need to know to kind of do your job each day as a wireless professional. 802.1x, obviously we use for authentication, encryption, and then the key exchanges and key rotations. That's important because as we start to look at the enhancements in the security technology, especially with WPA3 and OWE later, what you'll see is that we're always kind of tweaking the knobs on these things to make them a little bit better. So in cryptography, it's really the key exchanges that are the problem for us. That is the high resource, like the resource intensive, challenging piece. We don't do symmetric encryption there. So these things are important because how we start to do this with the different technologies that are coming out does impact what 802.1x looks like and how we configure stuff. These are really old. So when you see these slides, it says super old graphic. Yes, I know this is old. I'm just kind of using it as a demonstration point here. So again, this kind of just shows that what we're getting to is better key integrity and better encryption integrity throughout these progressions of technologies. This is your obligatory 802.1x, how the communication happens. I'm not going to dive into this because it's boring. I'm sure somebody else can cover it and has in an hour-and-a-half session at some point. And you can look this up if you really care and you're getting into packet analysis. But I do want to say this. This is a sample flow, and I don't know if I stole this one from Cisco or somebody else. It is important to understand that the EAP conversations are really happening between the endpoint and the authentication server. So I know we have the wireless stuff that's kind of crammed in the middle there. And so when you look at this dotted line down here, you guys know when you're setting up a wireless network, you choose the 802.1x and a couple of other things. If you've actually set up the radius server before, whatever is doing that back-end authentication, you know that there's additional stuff you have to put in there, and there's additional stuff you have to configure on the client. Our clients are getting a little bit smarter. They'll do some stuff on their own now and kind of steer us in the right direction, but there are some things that have to be configured. So I kind of point this out to you because I know one of the things that gets to be a little bit challenging here is if you look down the left, eep, 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 eep. Ooh, I feel like that, what's that little cartoon? Anyway, so all the EAP stuff is happening between the supplicant, which is your endpoint, and then whatever that enforcement point is. So your wireless stuff, controller, AP, whatever. And then that's just repackaging the same crap and sending it in a radius packet over to the authentication server, right? So over here, radius, eep, 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 eep. But that negotiation and those EAP tunnels are actually directly between the endpoint and the authentication server, which becomes important during troubleshooting stuff. The NPS policies, I know not everybody uses NPS. I kind of like to teach this or show this as a 101 gateway drug into doing a policy server configuration. So the construct of a connection request policy and then a network policy, which these are specifically Microsoft NPS terms. But the connection request policy is the thing that says, okay, let's match this traffic, and then if that traffic matches, let's go match it again over here and put a policy around it. I'm going to show you a couple of screenshots and examples here too. But the high-level bullets are here where typically your connection request policies might look something like, and let me I think actually this is a screenshot, right? Yeah, so what you're going to see here I go west again with my little highlighter. What you're going to see here is we have wireless, we have secure wired. What else is on there? There's probably some VPN stuff on there. So in an organization, that radius server is very likely being used for something other than wireless authentication. And if it's not now, it will be later. So what we're looking for here is we want to kind of inject and insert ourselves in the wireless world appropriately into this and not accidentally catch somebody else's traffic and not have another policy accidentally catch our traffic. And I know sometimes we don't necessarily get to touch these things, right? We're relying on somebody else somewhere else in your organization, or if you're an integrator, maybe at the customer organization, and you don't necessarily get eyes on this. But understanding this construct. Now, in a minute, I'm going to talk a little bit about other policy engines. So that could be Cisco ICE, it could be Aruba's ClearPass, it could be Fortinac, it could be anything that's kind of processing policy on the back end, similarly to this. So we contrast this, which is the connection request policy, with the actual network policy. So now we're going to say, okay, fine. This is saying if it's wireless traffic, right? If the type of data coming in is wireless, process it and match this rule. The next thing then is, okay, we match that rule, then what? And the network policy is where we get a little bit more granular. We say things like, if they're a member of this group, if the computer is a member of this group, if it's noon on a Tuesday, and then maybe we can do things like apply some enforcement rules, a dynamic VLAN assignment, or we can do vendor-specific attributes, VSAs that are in the radius server that push down other things, right? Dynamic ACLs, VLANs, whatever. So those are the two differences there. And I'm going to tell you this story because there's another one I want to tell you in a minute, and this is kind of laying the foundation. Stop doing weird shit with your policies. I'm sorry. Can I say that? Okay. Should have asked ahead of time. So stop doing weird things with your policies. I go in and behind people all the time where they just kind of like close their eyes and click stuff and pray. And then when it works, they go, okay, that's working. And then they go over here and something else happens. And then what happens is like somebody like me comes in later, or another organization comes in, and we're trying to do something like a VPN policy, or we're doing wired 802.1x, or we're doing, AttackX or radius authentication for network management. And some wireless person was in there and I mean, so me too, right? Like we just kind of, oh, that's working. Let's just go over here now. It's really, really important to be very accurate and very specific in these policies, because that radius server or that authentication server will at some point be used for something else, even if it's not right now. Okay, so some of the limitations, and I'm going to kind of talk through a little bit about this and kind of skim the surface. Is Andrew here? So we had a Twitter conversation, and we were talking about EAP chaining and TEEP, that was the RFC I fell asleep reading the other day, in case you're wondering. I don't know how many pages I got into it. I was reading a bootstrapping RFC that was pretty new, a few months old. Flipped over to the TEEP RFC, I don't know, got halfway through a 90-page RFC, and I was like, shit, I've read this before. I look back at the date, and I'm like, oh, yeah, this is like 10 years old. So we weren't using it then. Pretty sure we're not using it now. So I actually emailed Steve Hannon. I'm waiting on him to get back with me because he was one of the authors that I talked to 8 or 10 years ago when we thought this new EAP chaining thing was so cool. So I will talk a little bit about that. The logic and chaining, logging and accounting, scalability, and then just as a side note here, if you decide to do this in your lab and you are spinning this up on Microsoft, the MPS wizards are awesome. Just use them, please. The logic and chaining has to do with something really simple, right? Like in this type of infrastructure with MPS, your rules are ORs. They're OR rules, right? You don't get a lot of nested logic. You can't do an if, then, else, and ands and whatnot. So really like basic example, if you want to say, all right, in order to get on this network, you need to be on an organization-owned device and a known user in a certain group, and you go, okay, so let me build out this policy, and it says a computer in this group, and then the next thing is a user in this group. Those are OR statements. If anything matches any one of those, they're going to be allowed on, which is not usually the desired behavior, right? We want to kind of restrict that down. I have been doing network access control for so long. Our policy engines are very flexible and very granular. So we can layer a lot of logic. So back to that list I gave you of, Cisco ICE, Aruba ClearPass, Fortinac, Forescout, in any of them. We have that type of logic built into those policy engines. So I never worried about EAP chaining, but the principle behind EAP chaining with that TEEP protocol is, okay, we have PEEP, but that's kind of Microsoft. We have FAST, we have this, those are Cisco. We wanted a tunneled EAP that we could also chain, and it's a sequential chain, not a parallel chain. So what they wanted to be able to do is say, okay, so let's process this as one request, but there's a chain of inner authentications based on certificates, based on user passwords, based on whatever. And then the outcome of that is you have to pass each link of the chain with a thumbs up to get on. Nobody ever actually adopted it. Again, I'm kind of waiting to hear back from Steve to see what happened with that, because we were super excited about it back in 2012. And it never went anywhere. So Andrew, that's the answer to that question is I still think it didn't go anywhere, but I'm interested to see what Steve says about it since he was an author. All right, the logging and accounting. I'm going to show you guys this. This is another thing I think is really weird. Is the logging and accounting. I can't tell you how many times something's not working. I go in, and on the wireless infrastructure, radius accounting is not even enabled. And I don't know how anybody does ever set it up without that enabled. So we're going to talk about that in a second. So selecting the EAP methods. Yes, there are pages and pages of different EAP methods and EAP types. The two that I hit mostly in the past 15 years of doing this or so, PEEP, which is a protected EAP, which is Microsoft's, where you just send through the username and password from Windows, and then TLS, which is certificate-based. The one thing that I think people struggle with here is that you always, so we talk about certificate-based. That's what the client wants to send a certificate, right, to authenticate itself. The server still always has a certificate. So I'm going to have a bullet on that later, but we want to talk through that a little bit. And then the other piece here is eliminating unnecessary EAP methods for better security. So those connection request policy and that network policy I mentioned earlier, within that you get to specify what the authentication methods are. So if you have an 802.1x network and you're doing PEEP, a lot of times we talk about PEEP and then we talk about MS Chat v2 as the inner method, and people see MS Chat v2 listed as the authentication method, and they add it. And again, that's that kind of let's just add and click and then pray, and then it works and we don't touch it. But what's actually happening when that is selected is you are enabling a lesser secure authentication method that the organization probably does not need. So be very specific here. I already talked about the EAP chaining. And then I'm not going to spend time on this, but I do want to just point out that when we talk about doing 802.1x or pre-shared key, but 802.1x specifically here, there is a certain amount of client configuration that needs to be done. They very rarely auto-magically just work, right? And what that looks like is some things you might need to set here. So the EAP types that the client's going to use, the inner authentication method, the encryption algorithm, whether you're doing user or machine-based, if it's Microsoft, and then there's obviously stuff to be done whether you choose PEEP or TLS, right? So just a side note there. I'm not going to get into this in a longer session, and maybe by the hot tub, if you give me whiskey, I'll happily talk about this all day long. The native logging and NPS, and then something like ClearPass. ClearPass is just one example. We work with all kinds of stuff. I talked about that policy logic. The native logging is also something else, and I have a couple screenshots on that. The native logging built into NPS is just absolutely horrific, which is sad because when it was IAS, you could actually see stuff in the, whatever that's called, the event viewer or the system viewer thing. It was pretty cool. So now it's a hot mess. Troubleshooting. First thing is enabling logging. And I mentioned earlier, I don't even know how somebody sets this up and does not enable radius accounting. That's the first thing you need to do. And there's a slide on this to show screenshots later, so you can reference it, but you need to do that within the wireless infrastructure, and then you also need to do it on the radius server if it's in PS. You need to configure logging the first time, right? And I think these are the lovely little screenshots here. So in the wireless infrastructure, and again, I've been working with 802.1x for so long and radius technologies for so long, I don't think anything when I see radius accounting. I don't think anything when I see the 1813 port. That's just normal, vanilla, daily stuff. When I've talked to my fellow engineers and they say, oh, well, I didn't know what that, I don't need accounting. They're not associating that with logging. So the first thing, make sure you have this on the wireless infrastructure. This is what it looks like, and that's from our MIST environment. So it's going to look something, it should be called an accounting server, and you'll typically see 1813 as a port standard there. There are also certain platforms where it will, like, there's a little option to use the authentication server as the accounting server. You can just check that little box and move on with life. And then if you are using NPS, and I keep bringing up NPS again because it's, it's free if you've got Microsoft. If you're using a lab, that's typically what you're going to do. And so what you see down there is, let's see if I can use magic wand here. You have to enable it, enable logging, and then you need to configure it. And in our labs and our environments, I actually make a folder that says Radius Accounting Logs so I can find them because they go to some weird, obscure place and they're labeled with weird names that I would never be able to find. The next piece about troubleshooting is looking at why authentication failed if it does fail. So the two things there, obviously you have to have the login and the accounting enabled, or else what are you looking at? Oh, I know what you guys are looking at. Yeah, I know what you're looking at. You're going out there and you're taking over-the-air packet captures, and that's cute, but I don't do that. So I'm going to give you my way, because I'm lazy. So I mentioned that the native NPS logs are kind of horrific, so you can push them off to a SQL server. In the absence of doing that, it puts it in a text file. I love you guys so much, I had to redo this file like 3 times because I lost all my formatting. So what it is it's one long text file, like one long string. What you're looking at here is I pull it in Notepad++, which understands where the lines are wrapping, and I can easily put spaces between them so I can see what's going on. And then there's a few things that I look for here. I'm looking for packet types, and I'm looking for reason codes. And there's a few things highlighted in here. My rule for this talk was I didn't want to give you guys anything that I had to stop and look up, because I've been doing this a long time. If I have to stop and look it up, it's probably not something you need to know. I do look these up. They're easy to Google. What are the reason codes? What are the packet types? I do not memorize these. There are some links in here that will take you to websites with this stuff in it. Really easy peasy. I'm sorry that I picked a color that doesn't show up well. A reason code that is 0 is really good. A reason code that is anything but 0 is bad. We might not know why it's bad. I would go Google the reason codes, and here are some here. The other indicator here that something is not working is you'll see a packet type 3, which is an access reject. So again, this is just the NPS log I'm pulling here. So this will kind of give you an indication of what's going on, especially in a lab environment with NPS. If you do have something like ICE, ClearPass, Fortinet, yada yada, one of those things, they're going to package it really pretty for you. ClearPass is color-coded, like you really can't screw it up. It's awesome. It's kind of a shut up and take my money thing, just for that, because I hate doing this. And this file, by the way, is thousands of lines long, right? Like I knew the exact moment when I forced an error and pulled this out, and it still took me, I would say, 45 minutes to get to this point. Okay. So here are some links in these slides. There is one link that is not included that I really wish was. I just recently switched laptops, and the only thing in my whole life I've ever had bookmarked in a browser is Microsoft reason code page. Because I don't memorize them, I just look them up. And I can't find that exact link, but I found some similar, and they're here. The other thing I will tell you is that if you start playing around with this in the lab, it will look and behave very differently than in a production environment. It could be something as simple as a time server setting, a certificate, you bypassed a server validation. There's just a million things. I have never, ever, ever had this work in the lab, even in a customer environment lab, the same way that it works when I actually deploy it, right? So on wireless, it tends to be a little bit easier because we're used to doing it at 2NX and wireless. If you start branching out there, know that this can get a little bit quirky. Okay, how we doing? 5.5 minutes, awesome. Whew, certificates. Okay, I love certificates. I actually don't, I hate them very much. It's just kind of part of the job, right? So 2 things. The 2 main certs for wireless, and I think everybody knows this, but then we start doing stuff, we kind of forget it for like a split second, is that I'm going to start at the bottom because that's easy. If we have web portals, we typically want a certificate, especially in today's browsers, because most of them now are starting to force secured connections. So we get a certificate for that. There's a best practices slide right after this that kind of recaps everything, but I'll go ahead and tell you now that is typically is going to be a publicly signed cert from a trusted CA, and I'll explain that in a second. The other certificates are for your 802.1x networks, right, your internal stuff. So two things there. The radius server cert, whatever your authentication server is, wherever it is in the network, it needs a certificate, regardless of what you're doing, right? Even if you're doing non-certificate based authentication for the client, you still need that server certificate. And then if you are using client certs, obviously you need the certs on the client too. That gets into a PKI infrastructure, which I'm going to pretend like does not exist and just keep cooking. So here's your best practices here. Your radius server certificate really should be a domain issued certificate. If you're in a lab or you have a customer that's of a reasonable size that's manageable for you, it is actually not hard to spin up a CA, a Certificate Authority Service, within the Microsoft environment. It doesn't cost anything extra. If you're talking about a very large environment, you probably don't want to get in the middle of that unless you're a Microsoft person. But in small environments, so same thing with NPS. If you have a customer or you have a lab and NPS is not initiated or stood up at all and certificate services are not, you can do NPS in about a half an hour with any of the articles available on the internet. And the same thing with the CA server. I might say the CA server takes a little bit longer, maybe 45 minutes to an hour to kind of work your way through because there's templates and stuff you got to pay attention to. So I will ask, please don't, even in a lab, unless you absolutely have to, don't set this, there's a don't validate server certificate. Please don't do that. I've seen that selected and rolled into production a lot of times. That opens us up to a lot of vulnerabilities. And then don't use wildcard certs on your domain, for your domain authentication. A couple reasons. Aside from they're not very secure, they usually don't work. I actually haven't gotten them to work ever. And Microsoft, you find people who have kind of gotten hit and miss with it. I've seen somebody who said it did work, but I never got an answer about what infrastructure they were using. So there's that. It gets pretty messy. The publicly signed cert, obviously, for browsers is because you're making a face. So with certificates, I want to bury my head in the ground a lot of times, and so the ostrich just seemed like the right thing. So the browser needs the publicly signed cert, and that's just so a client coming in to your guest portal, just trust it, right? We don't have to do anything. We don't have to push a trust chain down to it. So 101 here with creating and managing certs, there's a CSR aspect, which is just you're requesting a cert. And then the other piece of that is the SAN cert. And I want to bring this up because this is another hiccup I see a lot. If you were doing things like clustering, anything, wireless controllers, things like ClearPass or authentication services, you have an opportunity to use a single certificate for all of those things together, which is what we prefer to do. It's less expensive, it's easier to manage. There are some benefits in managing it that way. So there is such a thing as a SAN cert. So that is a subject alternative name, which is just we can add other names to the cert, right? So we can cover several things in one certificate if we have a cluster instead of making individual certs. And that is our preference if we can do that. Okay, my last minute here, this is my soapbox. This is my half item that I just couldn't not talk about very briefly. And that is that I have seen a lot of content and some materials around wireless professionals, and we should be writing policies and whatnot. I kind of want to just lay some foundation here. We live in a world, whether we like it or not, where security is a big factor and a big driver in business and commerce and enterprise. And what we do and how we do it impacts the security posture of an organization, and the organization's tolerance for risk impacts what we do. And we have to kind of start having those conversations. So this is my little bit of a soapbox thing. Again, whiskey will get you way into this conversation if you want to. I do a lot of consulting with CISOs. So these are conversations I have a lot. I also work a lot with organizations going through different compliance requirements. And a lot that has to do with wireless, right? So Are we segmenting? Are we documenting? Do we have the controls in place? There is some red stuff on here. I don't know if you guys can tell. There's 4 or 5 things. So my kind of takeaway for you here is the policies do impact the authentication, the encryption schemes. Secure management, where we're using encrypted protocols. Proper segmentation, which can also be related to traffic paths. Are we bridging or are we tunneling that traffic? So especially in highly regulated industries, there is an issue there. And then knowing what's not encrypted. Those are kind of the 4 or 5 little takeaways there for you guys from security that I would like for you to remember. All right, so with that, there is a little bit more content at the end of this. I will make these slides available to you guys if Keith doesn't already do that. And thank you very much.